Welcome back, everybody, to the Skift Travel Podcast. I'm Skift's editor-in-chief, Sarah Kopit, flying solo today. But fear not, Seth will be back with us next week, as always. It was a record travel weekend for the 4th of July. If anyone else was out there like I was, you saw the traffic, you felt the lines. But what did that mean for some of the most important people in the sky? Today on the pod, we will chat with Sara Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants. But first, a quick reminder before we get started to send any questions you might have to podcasts@skift.com. And please don't forget to follow, subscribe, give us 5 stars, the whole kit and caboodle. If you like the Skift Travel Podcast, it helps us get out the word. So, Sara Nelson, did you travel for the 4th of July?
Thankfully, I did not travel for the 4th of July. I was at home actually recovering from COVID. Also trying to answer members' questions about contracts that we've just reached. So on a holiday like the 4th, where it was just, record after record after record after record, TSA screened 3 million people or something like that. How does that impact flight attendants? Like from the flight attendant perspective, what does that actually look like in real life, in real time? Summer travel in general is always very, very hard for flight attendants because we also tend to have people who don't travel as often. So they don't necessarily know the routines. There's more questions. There's more stuff, usually, that people are bringing. There's more families, which adds a level of complexity. And there's also a greater age range of people traveling, too. And so there's a lot of complications there, and our load factors are higher than they've ever been. Well, ticket prices may be falling, but we're not seeing the results of that in our workspace. In our workspace, we're still seeing full airplanes, not enough place to put everything. Summer is always harder because there's just less experience with traveling. And for flight attendants, this also means that when there's delays, there were significant delays yesterday because of the storms. The airlines that fly in and out of Texas got hit harder than anyone else, but every airline felt the effects of storms across the country, which is pretty normal for the summer. But that means that, you're dealing with people who didn't get where they were supposed to go and people who are not used to that. And there's usually a lot of complications that can add to actually health incidents that happen in our workspace. So it's pretty stressful. And it's also why people with any kind of seniority at all tend to bid the summers off.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about that.
Other than it's a nice time to be off too. But
yeah,
yes.
Exactly. So I can't remember the last time that we spoke. It was on stage at our aviation forum. And I can't remember if the election had happened yet. It was almost like right around that time. I think it hadn't. I think it was the end of October. And so we hadn't actually voted yet. But here we are, back in another Trump administration. How has the political landscape, what has that meant in practice for flight attendants? I think that most everybody has been a bit surprised at just how dramatic the changes have been under Trump 2.0. So what has that meant for the AFA?
So it's a lot of uncertainty, everyone is experiencing. And I think across the business world, it's never good to have uncertainty. But we really count on our federal partners. While we work for private companies, the air traffic controllers and the transportation security officers and the federal aviation inspectors, aviation administration inspectors are really important to everything that we do. We also count on USAID to be able to identify communicable disease and try to stop that before it gets to our airports. We count on the National Weather Service to have good route planning and also information during the operation itself so that pilots can steer around thunderstorms that can create turbulence in our workplace. So all of these things, the efforts to try to get people to leave with the voluntary resignation program and the efforts to try to disrupt and have air traffic controllers explain why their job is necessary, all of that has had a real destabilizing effect, and that's just never good in a safety environment. So we are experiencing the trail ends of it. It's not directly
in our direct workspace, but we are experiencing the effects of it. And I think the traveling public is too. And I think, for example, the travel over the July 4th weekend, I mean, it does beg the question, how many of those delays could have been avoided if we didn't have the 600 people leave from the National Weather Service? Would we have had better forecasts? Would we have had better attention to the aircraft route planning and the operational response right there? So, it's destabilizing. On the other hand, in fairness, what I will say is that while DOGE was pulling things apart and creating a lot of instability for our federal sector partners, who also were in jeopardy of losing their contracts, by the way, and we joined the TSA lawsuit and a judge stopped that from happening and kept the TSA contract in place. But while all of that was happening, I will give Secretary Duffy props for taking the 2024 FAA reauthorization bill and essentially supercharging it to try to staff up and modernize and get the money to be able to do that. While everything else that's going on sort of undermines all of that, I do give Secretary Duffy high marks on trying to stabilize our air traffic control system.
Yeah. So thoughts on the big, beautiful bill?
It's devastating. It's devastating for flight attendants. We're not going to see the full effects of it for a little while, but many flight attendants have parents who are using Medicaid and Medicare for their care. So it undercuts a lot of that. We're really concerned about the closing of rural hospitals and the access that we're going to have to healthcare because of it. It's why it was so important, for example, in the United Airlines contract that's being voted on right now, that we kept our healthcare options the same and we kept healthcare caps on our premiums. It's so important to lock that in right now because there's going to be a lot of pressure on healthcare across the board. And there's potential for costs rising too as fewer people are in negotiating with these with the insurance companies. So, the big, bad, ugly bill, I would say, was really, really disruptive for aviation, but for our economy in general and for working people across the board.
So the public is paying, like it or not, far closer attention to aviation safety in 2025 due to this kind of string of high-profile airline incidents. How have you seen that show up with how people treat flight attendants or how even flight attendants see themselves in the air?
So I would actually say, Sarah, that if you asked a flight attendant, like, how is it to fly right now and do you have public support? People oftentimes think of their worst experiences. But if you really ask them, like, what's the public support for flight attendants? I would say that flight attendants would agree that we are enjoying the highest level of public support we've ever seen. That doesn't mean our jobs are easier. Our jobs are harder than they've ever been. But I think that the public has the most insight into what we do. They certainly see the importance of our role as aviation's first responders. And they also have heard that we have been bargaining to get paid while boarding is going on, which we have never been paid in the history of our careers until these recent years and these recent contracts. And we're still in the process of locking that in all of the contracts across the industry. So I think that we have a lot of public support. It's just that our jobs are harder than ever. So we're seeing that in more holistic ways, like how we're reported out in the media and generally how people are approaching us when they're coming to the plane. But you still have passengers who have, their own gripes. And those are the things that we're dealing with on a daily basis.
Yeah. You've said before that flight attendants are, first responders. And, when you see the Alaska, Singapore tragedies, how is the AFA supporting its own members through the trauma of some of these events?
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. We have an AFA EAP program that is certified on its own, so separate from any companies, and it is really extraordinary what our EAP program does. Almost 70% of the members who called in had their problems resolved over the last year. Nearly 38% of all of our members called and asked for help with EAP this last year. That's relating to, say, numbers before the pandemic would have been somewhere around 10%. So 38% of members, asking for help from our EAP program is pretty extraordinary. In terms of disaster relief, we have an AFA disaster relief program. People can actually donate to that if you are feeling particularly empathetic towards flight attendants. That's one way you can help us out. These floods in Texas, for example, we're reaching out directly to the members that we know live in that area and may have been affected. And so we're pretty, proactive about getting help around members. When a critical incident happens, there are trained EAP reps who go directly with those flight attendants. For example, in Toronto, when those Delta Connection Endeavour flight attendants successfully evacuated everyone, it wasn't like they didn't have their own injuries or their own, trauma after the event. And they got direct support from our EAP program. It's a confidential program, so we don't ever talk about what people's problems were or what specifically happened. But we do that outreach whenever we know that someone may have been affected, and it's incredibly effective. We've actually been able to show that we put 12 to 18% back in our members' pockets, because when you can identify problems earlier, get people ways to resolve those problems, they can get back on the job and be productive, get back connected with their paychecks, sometimes get back connected with their healthcare. And that's a real service to our members that I'm very proud of that our union does.
So, you're the head of a union. What contracts are coming up right now? Which ones are you actively negotiating?
United Airlines is currently voting on a contract. It is overall the industry-leading contract. It adds $6 billion to the costs of the United Airlines contract over the next 5 years. And with the retro checks that would be paid, that's over $1 billion that will be paid out to flight attendants before the end of this year. So we'll get the results at the end of this month. Alaska and Hawaiian are in joint contract negotiations for that merger, so those are ongoing. And then we just got a contract at GoJet, which is a small regional airline that does flying for United Airlines, and we had got a contract at a charter carrier, ATI. And in both of those cases, those are significant pay increases and quality of life improvements, and improvements for flight attendants that you call reserve flight attendants, who are sort of sitting waiting for that assignment if there's a misconnection or if someone gets sick or something like that. So they have sort of last minute rules, and it's better to have more control over their schedules and pay. But across the board, the big demand in this round of bargaining has been boarding pay and other metrics of pay outside of those flight hours, because traditionally flight attendants were only paid, our big unit of pay was for the hours that we were away from the gate, so in the air and away from the gate only. And we have been adding additional metrics of time to that. We have the rest of the regional industry to negotiate for. So another significant one that the public may key to is PSA. PSA was involved in that midair collision outside DCA, and we're working to get their contract done. They've had an amendable contract for 2 years, and certainly those flight attendants deserve significant improvements, as they know very well. All flight attendants across the industry feel it when there's an accident, but of course, when it's your airline, you keep that close.
Yeah. All right. So we are going to take a quick break, and we will be back on the other side with more from Sara Nelson on everything airlines. Hey, everybody. I'm Sarah Kopit, editor-in-chief at Skift, and I've got to be honest with you, I am just blown away by how fast our industry is changing. AI is transforming how people book. Platforms are flipping business models and consumer behavior. It is more unpredictable than ever. And that's why I am so excited for this year's Skift Global Forum happening September 16th through 18th in New York City. This year's theme jumps into the future, Travel 2030, people, platforms, and new paths forward. You'll hear from leaders at Booking Holdings, IHG, AirAsia, plus dozens more shaping the future of travel. And this year, we've got more than just stage talks. We've got expert-guided roundtables and new networking formats designed to spark real conversation so you can do real business.
Expect it to be more interactive, more personal, and more valuable than ever. Join me and the rest of the industry at Skift Global Forum. Use the code PODCASTS for $800 off the full price at live.skift.com. Hope to see you there. Welcome back, everybody, to the Skift Travel Podcast. I'm on today with Sara Nelson. And so we were just talking about the various contracts and the bargaining that's going on right now. So we were talking during the break about how, it's been a couple of decades, in your view, of austerity. So what does that mean going forward now? Like, what are you looking for? How difficult is it? How is your relationship with the airlines changing?
Sure, significantly. And I think also the airlines are 80% organized. So think about that, like 80% of the workers in airlines get to go into collective bargaining and get contracts. And for the last 20 years, since 9/11, essentially, bargaining has not been normal. There was a whole string of bankruptcies in the early 2000s, and then there was a string of mergers that led to, and so that led to abnormal negotiations. Our careers were built up. The pilot's career has been being built up for 9 centuries, us for 8 centuries. 8 centuries, my gosh, decades. It feels like centuries. We have originally been negotiating contracts every few years, every 3 or 4 years. And you negotiate, and those negotiations usually take about 12 to 18 months, and you keep building the career that way. Because of all the cuts from the bankruptcy and the changes to the job that look like everywhere else across the economy, so what it essentially did was it cut pay drastically, which meant that people were willing to work longer hours because they had to have some way to make up for the loss of personal income. And what that meant was, blowing through 8-hour days, blowing through weekends, we never have weekends, but blowing through the sort of normal number of hours that people would work, an equivalent for flight attendants to like the 40-hour work week, or recognizing that the air traffic controllers in 1981 were on strike for a 32-hour work week when they were fired by President Reagan, and some of them were sent to jail. And now today we have air traffic controllers who are routinely working 60-hour works, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. That is typical across the economy. And certainly flight attendants are feeling our version of that. So in this round of bargaining, it was really, really important, first of all, to get the pay up. Because if we can get the pay way up, we're talking, like serious double-digit pay increases, we can then, people don't feel like they have to pick up those overtime hours. And we have more to then be able to negotiate in the next round around quality of life. And it wasn't as though we didn't negotiate those things this round. It's just, it was so important to get that pay massively up so that we would get more to outpacing that inflation and be in a place where then we can work on trying to get some of our productivity back for us, not just for the airlines. So that's where it's headed, but people have not had regular negotiations, so they don't really believe that it's going to get back to a regular place. And so what we have to do is start the clock on these negotiations. Under the Railway Labor Act, we have amendable dates. We don't have expiration dates, which means you don't have a definitive strike date, which makes it really hard to force the companies to work with us. So we have to be more strategic in our bargaining about being very targeted in what we're trying to accomplish, and that's how we're going to do this going forward. And the airlines have gotten, very, very cost conscious since those bankruptcies. They don't compete based on service anymore. They really don't. They compete based on cost. And what that has meant is reducing our staffing as well. I believe in the next round of bargaining, a major bargaining demand across flight attendant unions is going to be about staffing on the planes, because over 60 years, we never had to bargain over that because the airlines would always staff over the FAA minimums because they were competing on service. They don't do that anymore, so they're routinely sending these flights out with FAA minimums. And that makes our job even harder. It makes us harder to be able to respond to the issues on board. And there comes a point at which we really question whether or not it's safe.
So I'm glad you brought up staffing and to a certain extent hiring. It's something that we at Skift have been talking about a lot, which is just keeping and retaining talent within
a broad swath of the travel industry at large. That would include flight attendants. How is it right now? What is the environment like for flight attendant retention, for hiring, for getting people, to come in, to stay? I mean, that's a lot of what you're really trying to do, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, we always talk to the airlines because they always complain, oh, we can't hire people at that first year rate. And we say, well, that is your problem and you need to bring those rates up. But we are also negotiating for the career. So we're negotiating to get people in the door, certainly. But also we're negotiating to make sure that this is a place that you can have a good career job. And so it's a lot of what we talk about with the regional airlines. These have been some of the discussions. They know that they need to get the rates up because they can't retain people. And we are seeing that because this job is harder, even at the mainline carriers where typically the pay is a little better, the conditions at work tend to be a little bit better. We're seeing a higher rate of attrition across the board than we really ever have. And that is because of how hard the job is today. It's harder to get your feet underneath you. When I started in 1996, I had a lot of mentors on the plane, and we had time to actually learn the job and be with the passengers. And that's just not the case today. It's about rush, get that flight out. Do the minimal service that you're going to do on board because you only have time for that with the people that you have, and you're planning to do it between turbulence that occurs. You have to slow that down. Yeah. And so it's just, and they're longer days, usually more legs in the day. Flight attendants are just working a lot more during the day. It's a lot more exhausting, and our workspace is a hard workspace. We have we're working at an altitude of 8,000 feet in that cabin compressed air with recirculated air, sometimes that has contaminants in it. And we're working usually at an angle, pushing a 300-pound beverage cart up the aisle. Subject to burns and luggage falling on us and all kinds of things. So it's a hard physical job, and some people just, can't handle it. They couldn't handle it when I started in 1996. Some people would wash out because they'd get airsick or it wouldn't work for them. But today it's because the job is really hard and some people just can't do it.
And I suppose that changes in passenger behavior haven't helped anything. I mean, this is one of the things you see kind of like in the more mainstream media, passenger behaves badly. That seems to happen all the time. Has that really changed since the pandemic? Have you noticed a kind of an uptick in bad behavior? It certainly seems like that is the case. Are people actually harder to manage right now?
I'm going to say unequivocally yes, but I don't necessarily blame that on the pandemic. I do think that the pandemic played a role. I mean, we all sort of, were at home and not, for the most part, not interacting with other people. And it does feel a little bit like we forgot how to be around other people.
Correct. Yes, it does.
But also,
yes, it does.
but also, I would just say that some of the rhetoric coming from our leaders across the country, this started in 2015 with the presidential election. The way that we talk about each other and behave towards each other. There has been sort of a permission by this narrative in leadership that it's okay to be nasty towards each other and to not like people simply, to make snap judgments about people. And that has really not helped. And when we did see a change, actually, when we had President Biden stand up there at the State of the Union and say, pay attention to your flight attendants. Like that was things like that matter. It helped, for example, after 9/11 when Janet Reno was everywhere in every airport saying, see something, say something, and everybody knew, what they were supposed to be doing. People really do want to hear from their leaders about how to act, and it makes a really big difference. And we're dealing with the sort of output of not having this idea that we should be thinking about how we can be kind to each other rather than tearing each other down. Yeah.
So There's kind of been this long history of global solidarity between flight crews that I think that people will notice when they're in the airports or flying just in general. I'm curious what your take is about what's going on internationally right now that people in the U.S. maybe should pay attention to. I fly around a lot, obviously, for my job here with Skift, and airports, airlines, they're very different. When you go, it's interesting for me to see it when you fly, the national airlines of various countries and regions. So I'm curious if you're talking to travel executives or you're talking to people who work in the industry, is there anything that we can learn from our international cousins and friends out there?
First of all, aviation is global, and we we know that. We used to say that we fly to every corner of the earth, but now we have to fly around Russian airspace. We have to fly around airspace in the Middle East. In some cases, we have pulled out of certain routes because it's not safe to go to those locations. We have to be concerned in some places about the reception of Americans. And so when you have wars, I mean, that's the most egregious form of this. It's really disruptive. And then America has been a beacon of freedom and opportunity and where people want to come and experience and innovate. And it's really hard. Flight attendants do see that because we fly everywhere. We see the change in attitude towards our country, which is a concern. That is it is a huge concern. And we also see it, this is anecdotal, although I believe it's backed up by some reporting already. But, we're flying full airplanes to Europe, for example, and we're flying, half-empty airplanes back. And that's a huge concern. So we're concerned about the geopolitical environment. We're concerned about how we're getting along with everyone else in the world. And what I would say, too, is that I love the way that you led into this. We do feel a solidarity with flight crew around the world. We essentially do the same job. We often are dealing with a lot of the same stresses. We have harmonized regulations around the world. So often, the requirements on our job are very similar. The manufacturers, there's very few manufacturers. So we all fly on the same type of aircraft. And we know that when we can work together and harmonize regulations and procedures, everything goes a lot better. And we would love it if everyone would catch the spirit of solidarity. We know that aviation really flourishes when that happens, and we know also that our experience on board with all of humanity stuffed into a metal tube is better too.
Where do you not go anymore? You said you just said, I'm just curious. I actually don't know this. Where do you no longer go because it's not safe for Americans?
We have been pulling in and out of Israel, for example, and depending upon what the status is, and there are certain African destinations that we have stopped or slowed. There's also been India has been off and on, depending upon the schedules, and also the calculation of having to fly around certain airspace, which adds to the time of the flight and also the fuel that it takes to get everywhere. So there's a lot of considerations. It's not necessarily exactly what's happening on the ground, but it may be what's happening on the route to get there too.
Yeah, our team has done some really, really great and interesting work around like just the timing of that the geopolitical issues over Russia and then the Middle East. It's fascinating to me, how big of an impact that has on really everything in our sector.
Yes. And from time to time, there has been changes in places that we go in Central America too. So it's pretty dynamic, but the more stability that we can have around the world, the better that aviation does, for sure.
Yeah. So you've led the AFA through COVID, through contract fights, and now this kind of, this new era. I'm not going to put a name on it. We'll just call it this new era. What gives you hope or I suppose even keeps you up at night about like the next 5 years? Let's confine it to like the near term. What's your biggest like hope and dream, and what's your biggest fear?
Okay, so what gives me hope actually is that there is a greater understanding that working people across the board have been taking it on the chin for the last 40 years, and that in order to rebuild our economy, we have to do that from the ground up. I think there's a recognition of that. Whether or not that's happening politically is another subject, but just defining the problem and getting everyone on the same page about what really needs to change is the first step in making change. So I am hopeful about that. I am hopeful that working people can really, define our futures together and take action together and hopefully pull the politics to us, not party-based, but just pulling it more to the ground, to the people who need help. And I'm hoping that we can do that by organizing. So organizing at Delta Airlines, for example, is our contribution to that. 28,000 flight attendants who want a union, and where I see hope is in that organizing. There are flight attendants who are getting involved who have never been involved before, getting engaged in having a say in their workplace. And also then that gets them engaged in the public space too. And so I see a lot of hope in that. Well,
I must say what's happening here in New York City is stunning to me. I know it doesn't have anything to do with airlines, but just you talk about working people mobilizing, organizing, absolutely. I don't know. I watched the results
people are finding working people are finding real commonality together that didn't necessarily exist before. Even when people are telling us that we're more divided than ever. I don't think it's true. I don't think that's what we're seeing bear out in these organizing drives, in the desire for unions, and in elections like in New York City. So I see real hope and opportunity there. What I'm concerned about is, I always think about the 4 Ds of union busting: divide, delay, distract, and demoralize. And that last one is the worst one. So we're going to go through some really rough times, partially because of this big ugly bill, as I call it. And also just because of the way that we're treating other people and the kind of name that we're giving ourselves as a country. But I'm worried about the harm that that's going to do, and I'm worried that that is going to lead to people being demoralized. But we're organizing against that. So that's my biggest fear, Sarah. And I'm just going to name this right now, something very specific. The Dobbs decision started that. That's a demoralization of women across the board about, not being able to make choices in our own lives and about our own bodies and get the health care that we need. And my concern, for example, is that when flight attendants take off and touch down, they have different rights throughout their workday, depending upon where they land. And so my biggest fear that you were asking is that people will become demoralized by the cruelty, by the inability to get help, and that will lead to a competition between workers as opposed to the worker solidarity that I was talking about. So I'm going to end on the solidarity. I actually think that this is going to spur massive organizing, and we have a real opportunity to just change the way that our entire economy is built, and hopefully get back to, the promise of what I had my hand over my heart every morning in kindergarten. I always think about this, Miss Muldoon's classroom. She was famous and infamous in our town. And we stood there, little kindergartners with our hands over our heart saying, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. And I thought that was a solemn promise that we made to each other. And I think that there's still a lot that we need to do to make good on that promise. But I know that when I've experienced that, those have been the best times. That's when I've felt the best in my life. That's when I've had the most hope. And I see a real opportunity for us to get back to that.
Well, Sara Nelson, that is a fantastic place to end our chat today. President of the Association of Flight Attendants, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Sarah. It's always good to talk to you, and always fly safe.
Thank you for listening to the Skift Travel Podcast. Wherever you're listening, please make sure to subscribe. If you like what you're hearing, rate us 5 stars or leave us a positive review. It really helps get the word out about us, our podcast, and make sure that we can still continue to bring it to you free of charge every week.
If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell as well. That way you'll know every time we have a new episode.